My name is Paikia Apirana.
Go on, bub.
And I come from a long line of chiefs stretching all the way back to Hawaii, where our ancient ones are. The ones that first heard the land crying and sent a man. His name was also Paikia. And I'm the most recent descendant. But I was not the leader my grandfather was expecting, and by being born, I broke the line back to the ancient ones. It wasn't anybody's fault, it just happened.
All right, welcome back, folks. Today we're going to take a look at a debate between Susan Oken and a number of people who respond to her essay, and that includes Will Kimlicka, who we've already read. It's a debate about the sort of uneasy fit between feminism and multiculturalism. Now, it may not come as a surprise to you that someone would suggest that there's an uneasy fit there, because in the last 5 years, it's been really a lot more common to hear critiques of liberal feminism as a sort of maybe white women's feminism, or you've heard other critiques as well. So most recently, transgender activists criticized J.K. Rowling, for instance, for her liberal feminism and the theory of gender that's behind it. But I'll tell you this, it really did come as a huge surprise 20 years ago when this book came out, Is Multiculturalism Bad for Women? It really came as a huge surprise, and it sparked, at least in academia, the first debate that sort of showed that feminists and multiculturalists, although they were both generally on the left of the political spectrum, might have fewer things in common than was once thought. Now, in the early 90s, when I went to college, feminism was ending what some have called a sort of first stage of development, a 25-year war that feminists thought to be accepted even as a plausible ideological viewpoint. And I'll tell you, that was a brutal and that was a vicious fight. I lived through it in my teenage years. By the late 80s, you were starting to see things like women's studies programs appear on campus. But there wasn't a total victory at that stage. The opponents of feminism had, I think we could observe, actually sort of won something themselves. They succeeded in labeling the word itself, feminism, as sort of a dirty word. For lots of people, feminism, still to this day, the word conjures an image of a relatively extreme leftist view. But the odd thing is that the fundamentals of feminist beliefs from the late 1980s and early 1990s, equal rights and equal opportunities for women, are now almost universally accepted, at the very least on the college campuses and among the professionals who are trained on those campuses. And I bet you've never even thought about this, but those exact things, equal rights and equal opportunities, were exactly the things that people were at war about in the 1980s. So some have observed that the belief label that goes with those policies is sometimes rejected, but the policies that were so controversial in what they called the era of PC, political correctness, are pretty widely accepted these days. In a poll in 2020, 60% of women identified as feminist to any sort of degree, only 60%. But that's actually up during the Trump era, since before Trump, the numbers were actually at about 50% and even much lower before that. But in those very same polls, almost all of the women say that they support the policies that feminism actually brought about in the late 1980s and 1990s. It was at the time really hotly disputed, at least outside of universities, whether equal rights for women really meant special programs for women, whether that might be what's required. For instance, in law firms, they initiated such programs in order to recruit and retain women on the leadership ladder. Back in the 80s, when men saw that women didn't achieve partner in law firms at the same rate that men did, men would just say that women weren't really cut out for the work, or that they decided to have families instead. Now, especially starting in the early 1990s, law firms have special programs to try to help women have families and stay on the partnership track at the same time. In fact, most law schools won't even let a law firm recruit on their campus unless they have such programs. And by the early 2000s, women actually overtook men and comprised more than half of entering law school classes. So apparently, it should come as no surprise to you, women think that they are cut out for the work. As another parallel example, let me tell you about academia back then. Back then, when men saw that women didn't achieve tenure at as high rates and that they weren't paid equally when they got there, they just said that, well, women had often opted off of the tenure track in order to have kids. And even if women stayed, they didn't publish as much or become as famous because they had opted to concentrate on their kids. But this year, you've already seen, Princeton actually settled a lawsuit and paid more than $1 million in back pay to women who'd been unequally treated over the course of time. And Princeton, like almost every other university, has programs designed to help women stay in university work, stay on the tenure track, even as they raise children or do lots of service work on campus. Now, all of these policies at law firms and in academia are, in a sense, special rights. They're very much like Kymlicka's special rights. They're meant to enhance equality of opportunity, enhance individual rights for women. But they were fiercely opposed not long ago. So again, people have observed that, oddly enough, while feminists didn't win the battle over the word feminism, they won the war over the policies. Now, that's not the conclusion that these policies fix all problems, and it's not the conclusion that they do enough. It's also not the conclusion that these policies aren't controversial today, but they're nearly universally followed and much more widely accepted now than they were in the 80s and the early 90s. In the 2000s, then, multiculturalists thought that they were seeing sort of the same turn of events occur. The word multiculturalism was being rejected by some, but the same policies that had made some people sick with worry in 2000 and in 2010 are now broadly accepted, especially when it comes to, say, multicultural education in schools. There is no doubt, wherever you were raised, that you had a multicultural education, even if the people around you rolled their eyes when they heard the word. Now, academics of 20 years ago thought, at least in part for the reasons that I've given you, that feminism and multiculturalism were sort of two of a kind, not too far from each other. Both sought, at least in their liberal forms, to enhance the individual rights of a group or groups that had been excluded in the past using policies that extended some special rights. So, Susan Oken's essay, Is Multiculturalism Bad for Women, sort of hit like a bombshell. And as you saw from the responses that you read in the book, it quickly became the subject of a war between some people who had previously really considered themselves allies. At least to some degree, they were allies in the progressive cause, now split over the ideas in this book. In Katha Pollitt's response, for instance, she indicates that this really shouldn't have been a surprise to anybody who had been involved in left or progressive politics. Academics might have thought that all leftist causes fit together, or that all rightist causes fit together, but their intellectual systems are sort of castles in the air. Pollitt says that people who are engaged in politics always knew better. They always knew that liberal feminism and multiculturalism were an uneasy fit, to say the least. But still, it's worth asking, why all of the surprise between academics, at least? On one level, Oken's objective seems, if not uncontroversial, at least to be less than inflammatory. One of her goals is to remind multiculturalists that there are some illiberal aspects of some cultures, and to suggest that if, like Kymlicka, they care about preserving individual freedom, then they're going to have to be more willing to make demands for reform from some of these cultures. Women, she suggests, have to be given more power, both formally and informally, within the cultures out there, so that we can actually be sure that they're living a life within that culture that truly is an enhancement of their freedom, as Kymlicka had wanted. But on the other hand, Oken's essay seems, to some of the people who read it, to degenerate into attacks on non-Western cultures. A lot of people objected that Oken never even considers that women from non-Western cultures might actually endorse the practices of their culture. That's an argument that Sarah Song picks up in the chapter from her book that's on your syllabus. Instead, these objectors say, Oken really just looks out there at all of these non-Western practices that she considers strange and abhorrent in certain ways, and she advocates using the state to put an end to these. putatively in the name of liberal rights, but really in the name of an aggressive state. She's a liberal imperialist, some people said. And that's basically Homi Bhabha's accusation in his reply to Okun. He says on page 82 that Okun just basically looks at all non-Western cultures as, he says, pre-modern customary societies, and argues for what he calls an aggressive state intervention. Okay, so as we've done all term, we want to look at the origin of these understandings of Okun's book. How can it be read in two ways? And we also want to look at the origins of the policy dispute that people had over this book. And we want to do that, of course, so that in the end, we can consider what it is that we might say about some of the more controversial practices that she discusses, and about some of the more controversial ideas that she uses theoretically. And we're going to look at this, of course, by looking first at a hashtag puzzle in Okun. It's precisely because her argument is ambiguous on one really important point that you see some people reading her in one way and some people reading her in another way. So let's take a look at one way in what remains of this video, and then in the next video, take a look at the other way that people read her. Okay, now, like I said, the book seems to start relatively uncontroversially. Okun defines her terms on pages 10 to 11. First, she says that feminism is the belief that women should not be disadvantaged by their sex, that they should be recognized as having human dignity equal to that of men, and that they should have the opportunity to live as fulfilling and as freely chosen lives as men can. Then multiculturalism she defines, and she basically has Kimlicka in mind here, as the claim made in the context of basically liberal democracies that minority cultures or ways of life are not sufficiently protected by the practice of ensuring the individual rights of their members, and as a consequence, they should also be protected through special group rights or privileges. Now, no doubt you'll recall that Kimlicka's argument had relied on the idea that the social power of some minority cultural groups might have to be equalized in a sense, so that they wouldn't be outbid or outvoted by the majority culture, an idea that he gets to on page 109. So if the minority culture was attempting to preserve their culture in some sense, which we know he says is important as the context for the choices that they make, they would get certain external protections against the outside cultures. Now, in one sense, Okun just wants to remind multiculturalists like Kimlicka that social power can be unequal within a culture as well, not just between cultures. Especially, she wants to remind him that the social power of women could be virtually nil within these cultures. And she wants to say that this inequality of power might have real effects on the extent to which women experience their culture as a support for their freedom. Indeed, she thinks that women may experience quite the opposite. So consider what she says on page 12. She says that most cultures, including Western ones, are built upon ideologies of gender, and men might control women, she says, especially informally in the private sphere. If men have the power in cultures and they use it to articulate what sort of Kimlickian protections their culture really needs, well, Okun says this: under such conditions, group rights are potentially, and in many cases actually, anti-feminist. This substantially limits the capacities of women and girls of the culture to live with human dignity equal to that of men and boys, and to live as freely chosen lives as men and boys can. Obviously, they are referring back to the definition of feminism, which I had just covered. So, not unlike Kimlicka, and of course, going back to the definitions that I covered just recently, she seeks policies which support women's human dignity equal to that of men, and that lead to women's ability to lead as freely chosen lives as men. So Okun just seems to want to remind Kimlicka that policies that protect cultures might backfire. There also needs to be attention paid to equal social power within cultures. Then, as a sort of mirror image of that argument, she criticizes the way that multiculturalist policies have been used by male policymakers in the West as well. She suggests that the need that women have for equal social power within Western cultures is also overlooked. So her example of this is on pages 9 to 10. It's the example of the French debate over the banning of the hijab for young Muslim girls in French schools. And she criticizes the French for this because they've apparently been willing to intervene in Muslim immigrant culture, that is forbidding the hijab, when what was at stake was the French ideal of national unity and fraternité, égalité. But at the same time, the French were willing to extend cultural rights that allowed Muslim immigrant men to practice polygamy, despite the burdens that this places on women within their culture, and even when some women's voices from within this culture are saying that polygamous practices are oppressive to them. But here's our hashtag puzzle. Oken doesn't want the French to back off because of their hypocrisy. She wants them to be more interventionist on the hijab and on polygamy and on many things. Perhaps, as it turns out, the way that she means dignity equal to that of men, and the way that she means as freely chosen lives as men, is that we have to compare the respect and the choices available to all women within a minority culture to the respect and the choices available to women in Western cultures. They must have equal dignity to that of Western men, freely choose like Western men do. And she wants that for herself too, but her critics think it'd be inappropriate to force the liberalization of these cultures with the excuse that it helps women. Okay, so that's our hashtag puzzle. And in our next video, we're actually going to try to figure out what it is she really does mean by these words and how it leads to the policy positions that she takes. And then, of course, we'll look at critics of her along the way. I'll see you then.